What would happen if a black CEO walked into his own store but was treated as someone unworthy of being served? Have you ever wondered what would happen if a CEO returned to the very store he once founded? Not as the company's figurehead, but as an anonymous customer blending into the crowd. For Elijah Monroe, that Saturday morning didn't begin with a board meeting, a revenue report, or a phone call from investors. It began with an old hoodie, a low-pulled baseball cap, and a quiet stare into his rearview mirror. His car was parked right outside the very first out-of-state branch of Monarch Goods, a place where, nearly a decade ago, he had cut the ceremonial ribbon with trembling hands full of hope. But today there was no red carpet, no cameras, and certainly no CEO title. There was only a black man silently observing the child of his vision through a glass pane, wondering if the values he once poured into it, respect, fairness, kindness, still lived behind that thick pane of glass and the branded logo. The reason Elijah had come was clear. For months now, whispers had surfaced, on social media, in internal reports, through customer surveys, about silent discrimination, detached service, and a fading sense of welcome. What haunted Elijah most was the feeling that he had drifted too far from the ground truth. He didn't want to hear filtered versions through layers of middle management. He needed to feel it for himself, through his own eyes and heart. That's why the same man who used to stride across conference stages now quietly adjusted the strap of his canvas bag and stepped out of his car like any other shopper. Unnoticed, unimportant. The automatic doors opened. Elijah walked in, leaving no trace of authority or status behind him. The blast of cold air from the AC greeted him like an indifferent handshake. The scent of fresh plastic from the shelves mixed with the laughter of children, the rolling of carts, and the sound of card readers beeping. On the surface, everything seemed fine, even efficient. But Elijah hadn't come to observe the surface. He came to listen to what no one dared to say, to see what no one dared to point out, because he knew well. Sometimes the most rotten things are hidden beneath the shiniest polish, and sometimes, to truly see the light, you must step into the dark. Elijah walked deeper into the store, eyes sharp, mind ready for a journey whose destination even he couldn't predict. But one thing was certain, he hadn't returned to check inventory. He had come back to verify trust. It didn't take long for Elijah to realize that the silence in this store wasn't just a normal pause. It was an unsettling, indifferent, even cold silence. The kind of atmosphere he had never felt in any other Monarch Goods location. He walked slowly past the neatly arranged aisles, brushing his fingers lightly over the items on display, as if he were just another customer browsing for something for his family. But his eyes stayed fixed on the electronics counter, where a young man stood. His name tag read Tyler, holding a phone with a blank stare, completely oblivious to anyone moving around him. Elijah approached and picked up a Bluetooth speaker. A pricey item, not the kind someone grabs just to browse. He gently placed it on the counter, making just enough sound to draw attention. Tyler didn't react. No eye contact, no smile, no greeting. Elijah gave a polite smile and asked, "Do you know if this model works outdoors?" The young employee glanced up briefly, then looked back down at his phone as if the question were meaningless. "Probably does, I guess," Tyler replied in a flat, cold tone. Elijah nodded calmly and continued. "Could you check for me? I'd like to be sure before I buy it." Tyler flipped the box over and skimmed the back, then muttered, "It says weatherproof," pushing the box back toward Elijah without another word, offering no further explanation. Elijah felt a chill run down his spine, not from the air conditioning, but from the apathy that had just presented itself in full. He pressed further, testing Tyler's patience one more time. "What about connectivity? Can it pair with multiple devices?" Tyler squinted, clearly irritated. "Read the back. It's all there. Or pick another model. I'm busy." Elijah stood silent for a few seconds, watching the young man who made no effort to hide his frustration. He wasn't angry. At least not yet. But a growing sense of disappointment started pressing against his chest. This wasn't just unprofessionalism. This was disdain, a calculated kind of coldness, And Elijah began to wonder. If he, a black man dressed in everyday clothes, was treated this way, how many others had silently walked away hurt? He left the counter without saying another word. But in his mind, one thing had become clear. If there was a problem in this store, it wasn't in how the products were arranged. It was in how people looked at one another, or more accurately, how they refused to. And he knew he had to go deeper. Elijah continued walking through the aisles like a patient shopper, but inside him was a rising undercurrent. He didn't take any notes, didn't pull out his phone to snap pictures or record audio, because he hadn't come here to collect evidence. He came to feel, and what he was feeling now was an undeniable wrongness. While pretending to examine a neatly arranged cookware set, Elijah paused, not because of the item, but because of a hushed exchange just behind him. Quiet but clear enough to catch. Two young male employees stood at the far end of the aisle, unaware that anyone was nearby. One of them nodded toward Elijah and whispered, "Guys like him probably just come in to look around. Who dresses like that and actually buys anything decent?" The other let out a dry chuckle. "He looks broke. Bet he's reading the price tags on everything." Elijah stood still, eyes fixed on the item in front of him, heart pounding. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. He hadn't misheard. They didn't know who he was, and they didn't care that he might be within earshot. All they saw was a black man dressed plainly, and they assumed he couldn't possibly be a real buyer, not a worthy customer, not someone who matters. Elijah bit down on his lower lip, holding back the anger rising inside him. He knew that speaking up now would only trigger defensiveness or denial, and he wasn't here to win an argument. He was here to understand what was truly happening beneath the polished surface of the brand he had built. But what stunned him wasn't just the words, it was the ease with which they were said. As if mocking customers was a routine part of the day, no caution, no embarrassment. Elijah realized in that instant, this wasn't just the behavior of a few individuals. It might be the product of an environment that had quietly tolerated, even normalized, this kind of silent discrimination. When the two employees walked away, Elijah stayed still, his fingers gently gripping the strap of his bag. Those words weren't spoken to him as a CEO. They didn't know who he was, and that made it hurt even more, because it revealed exactly how they truly saw a customer like him. And if such truth could reveal itself in just one short morning, Elijah knew he couldn't stay on the sidelines any longer. He had to look directly at the root, and he understood. The hardest part of this investigation was still ahead. Elijah quietly returned to the area near the checkout counters, where long lines of people waited their turn, like in any big store on a weekend. He no longer had any interest in shopping, nor any intention of taking an item home, but he wanted to observe, to see if the coldness he had just experienced was the whole picture of this place, or if there were still small glimmers of warmth left amid the gloom. And then he saw her. A middle-aged woman with her hair neatly tied up, her movements gentle yet decisive, helping an elderly man deal with a faulty barcode scanner. Even though the line behind him was growing, her face showed no sign of losing patience. She smiled softly, bent down to adjust the machine, reassuring the customer that it wouldn't take much longer. There was something about the way she worked that Elijah couldn't look away from, and he decided to choose her as his cashier. Not because of the item in his hand, but because he needed to test something. Was there still a trace of the spirit he once instilled in this place? When his turn came, Elijah placed the Bluetooth speaker on the conveyor belt. The cashier scanned it with calm professionalism, then looked up and smiled. "Did you find everything you needed today?" Her voice wasn't loud or overly cheerful, but it held just enough warmth to pull Elijah back to an older version of himself. When he used to work the register at his very first store, greeting every customer like a longtime friend. Elijah gave a faint smile. "Actually, I think I'll leave this. I'm not quite sure yet." She nodded without pressing, showed no irritation, didn't question his reason. "That's perfectly fine," she said. "If you need anything else or want help learning more, just let me know. I'm always here." Elijah glanced at the small name tag on her chest. Olivia. A simple name, but one that carried with it a kind of quiet energy completely at odds with everything he had just experienced in other parts of the store. He stepped aside, watching her handle a few more customers. each one receiving the same kindness, the same full presence in her eyes and words. Olivia wasn't a blazing flame, she was a steady light that never went out, silently upholding the bare minimum standard of human dignity in an environment that seemed to have forgotten it. As the crowd began to thin, Elijah slowly stepped closer, pretending he was about to ask something. Olivia turned to him and nodded gently. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Elijah shook his head, but this time his eyes grew serious, though his voice stayed soft. "Thank you, truly. You're the best thing I've seen all morning." Olivia looked a bit surprised, but kept her familiar smile. "I just try to treat people the way I hope to be treated, no matter who they are." Elijah nodded, his heart heavy, because that simple sentence carried a painful irony. If Olivia was the example of what was right, then why had kindness become the exception instead of the norm? Why had something as basic as a welcoming smile made him feel grateful, as if it were a rare privilege? Elijah left the register with no purchase, but with a renewed clarity. Monarch Goods hadn't completely collapsed, but it was slipping down a slope, and only a few like Olivia were trying to hold it back. And if he did nothing, people like her would be drowned out and disappear. And when that happened, the brand name would be nothing more than an empty shell. Elijah returned to his car like a man waking from an unfinished dream. He sat behind the wheel, eyes fixed on the storefront, though not truly looking at anything. The midday sun streamed through the windshield, casting a faint beam of light across the steering wheel. The Monarch Goods logo stared back at him, a symbol he once cherished as a badge of pride, a testament to a journey built from nothing. But now, it felt more like a lingering question. "Is this still your company?" Elijah took off his cap and slowly rubbed his face. He didn't feel the rage often portrayed by CEOs in television dramas. He didn't shout, didn't slam the dashboard. The only thing he felt now was a vast emptiness, the kind of feeling that can only surface when you've lost connection with something you once believed was truly yours. He thought back to the early years when Monarch was just a small store with a handful of employees. Back then, he personally mopped the floors, ran the register, checked inventory, and more importantly, trained every team member himself. He once told his very first hire, "We're not selling products, we're building trust." He believed that if that culture stayed intact as the company grew, Monarch would never lose its way. But the business expanded, the staff multiplied exponentially, and Elijah had to delegate more responsibilities to supervisors, regional managers, department heads, people he believed would carry the torch for him. They sent thorough reports, KPIs were always met, customer satisfaction scores high enough to feel reassured. But perhaps it was those safe numbers that had lulled him to sleep. He thought about Tyler, about the two young men in the home goods aisle, about the subtle weight in their eyes as they looked at him. That same gaze he had faced hundreds of times in the past, back when he was a young black man, applying for jobs in supermarkets only to be turned away with excuses like, "We're fully staffed." And now, in the very company he built, it was happening again, this time at the hands of people he paid. Elijah took a deep breath. He didn't ask whether this was an isolated incident or a widespread issue, because he knew if such behavior could happen so naturally in one store, then it was very likely quietly spreading elsewhere. The real question was, why wasn't it being reported? Why had no one spoken up? Was it fear of losing their job? Or had they stopped believing the system truly cared about fairness? Olivia's image returned to his mind. A person still carrying the flame, yet clearly standing alone. If someone like her wasn't supported, wasn't heard, how could she sustain that positive spirit in a team that had grown indifferent? Elijah leaned forward and opened the glove compartment, pulling out a small leather-bound notebook he always kept in the car. The cover was worn, the page edges frayed, but each page held important reflections from his entrepreneurial journey. He flipped to a blank page, picked up his pen, and wrote, "We cannot expect employees to act with integrity if our company culture silently permits wrongdoing. Trust is not enough. We must build systems that protect it." Elijah closed the notebook and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He knew clearly, if he walked away now, silence would return. But if he turned back, he would have to confront not a person, but an entire structure that had allowed indifference to take root. And that, precisely, was what he was about to do. Elijah stepped out of the car with a slow yet resolute stride, as if each footfall carried the weight of a long-held disappointment. He didn't adjust his cap, didn't lower his gaze like he had when first entering the store. This time, he wanted to face everything head-on, no longer hiding in the shadows. No one inside the store knew that the man now approaching the customer service counter was the very person behind the entire system they were working for. Elijah asked to speak with the manager, his voice neither loud nor cold, but firm enough to make the desk clerk lift their head and look at him more closely. A few minutes later, a stocky, middle-aged man emerged from the admin office. His name tag read, Michael, store manager. His face held the kind of default politeness typical of someone used to dealing with difficult customers, confident that his experience could handle anything. Hello, I'm Michael. How can I help you? Elijah didn't extend a hand for a shake, didn't engage in small talk. I'm Elijah Monroe, he said, looking him straight in the eyes, founder of Monarch Goods. In that moment, Michael's expression froze. His eyes flicked quickly down to Elijah's simple outfit, then back to his face, as if struggling to reconcile two completely different realities. If I had known, he stammered, but Elijah raised a hand to cut him off. Exactly. You didn't know. And that's why I'm here. There was no conference table, no assistant, no slideshow presentation. Only the truth. Elijah recounted everything he had experienced that morning. The averted eyes, the condescending words, the quiet but clear discrimination. He didn't raise his voice, but his steady tone struck each sentence like blows on the foundation of a building already showing cracks. Michael remained mostly silent, nodding occasionally, his hand reaching up from time to time to adjust his collar as if the room had grown short of air. But Elijah didn't stop at just relaying his experience. He emphasized, this is no longer about individual actions. This is culture, the kind I believed I had built the right way. And if I hadn't shown up today, how many others would have been treated the same without anyone ever knowing? Michael opened his mouth. I've always thought my staff were doing fine. They meet their targets. There haven't been any direct complaints. Elijah shook his head, his gaze not accusatory but unflinching. The problem isn't in the metrics. The problem is when disrespect becomes normalized and no one sees it as wrong. A passing employee caught sight of Michael and Elijah speaking together, hesitated briefly, then quickened their pace. The store's atmosphere was no longer carefree. An invisible tension was beginning to spread like a chill before a storm. Elijah tilted his head toward the employee break room. I need to speak with the entire team, right now. No announcements, no prepared speech, just a real conversation. Michael nodded, offering no resistance, as if he now understood, or at least accepted, that something much bigger was about to unfold. Elijah walked toward the break room, not driven by anger or revenge, but by quiet resolve. He knew this well. To save a company, you can't just change the numbers. You have to change the heart. And if that heart had lost its rhythm, then now was the time to reset it, without compromise. The employee break room, once merely a place for rushed lunches or a few minutes of rest between shifts, now felt stifling in an unfamiliar way. Staff filed in one by one, and the murmur of conversation gradually faded as they noticed a stranger standing beside the manager. Each face wore a different expression: surprise, curiosity, confusion, and then total silence settled over the room when Michael said plainly, "This is Mr. Elijah Monroe, founder of Monarch Goods." Elijah didn't stand on a podium, didn't bring a projector or charts. He simply stood among them like a member of the team he had long been absent from. "Hello, everyone," he began in a calm but clear voice. "I'm not here to give a speech. I'm here to speak the truth." Every eye was now fixed on him. No one feigned indifference. Some people clasped their hands, others looked down. Especially those faces Elijah had seen earlier that morning. I walked through this store this morning. No one knew who I was, and that's exactly what I intended. I wasn't wearing a suit, I didn't have a CEO badge, I was just a regular customer. And I was ignored, judged by my appearance, and spoken about behind my back. The room went completely still. Elijah turned to look directly at Tyler, the young man from the electronics counter. Tyler stared at the ground, his face pale, hands clenched. "You refused to help me," with a look that didn't even try to hide your disdain. "But worse," Elijah paused for a moment, "I overheard 2 employees in the kitchen area talking about me, saying I clearly had no money, that I was just there to browse. None of you knew who I was. But that's the issue. If I were just an anonymous customer, does respect still apply?" A woman in the corner of the room took a quiet, deep breath. A few exchanged uneasy glances. Elijah didn't raise his voice, but each sentence felt like it peeled back a familiar mask. "I'm not here to get anyone fired, but I need you all to understand this isn't just a store, this is a brand built on trust. And if that trust is broken, everything else, from inventory to sales numbers, means nothing." Elijah scanned the room, his gaze settling on faces like Olivia's. Those who still upheld the values he once believed were unshakable. He gave her a small nod, then turned to the group. "This isn't just about individual behavior. This is about culture. And I won't let it continue to slide." Tyler mumbled something under his breath, but no one caught it. Elijah stepped forward, his voice firm. "I once believed that I could delegate authority and still preserve the original spirit of this place. But today, I realize I was wrong. Not because you're not good enough, but because I didn't check closely enough. I allowed the distance between leadership and staff to become a blind spot, and I share responsibility for that." The room stayed quiet. No one spoke, but there was no resistance anymore. Elijah looked at each person one more time, then closed with an invitation. "If you still believe in why you chose to work here, then let's begin again. If not, then this is the moment for you to decide." And he knew that moment. The moment of truth and reckoning would become the turning point for the entire journey ahead. After a few seconds of silence that felt like they stretched on for an hour, Elijah quietly stepped back, no longer standing at the center of attention, letting the focus shift to the team now confronting the shadow within their own culture. Some faces began to relax. Not out of relief, but from the realization that the worst of the storm had passed, and it was now time to rebuild what had been broken. Elijah took a deep breath and continued, his voice lower but just as steady. "From this day forward, Monarch will no longer be what it was. And that's not a threat. It's a commitment." He turned to Michael, his gaze not accusatory but sharing in the weight of accountability. "We'll start by rolling out mandatory training across the system, not just on customer service but on bias awareness, on how we see others without judgment. Kindness isn't instinctual. It's a skill, and skills can be learned." Michael nodded, this time with a firm resolve, as if he too had just been pulled from a long slumber of complacency. Elijah faced the entire staff again. "I'll be visiting stores across the network, unannounced, without going through management, not to catch mistakes, but to listen, to understand whether what I saw today was an isolated incident or a sign of a deeper illness rooted in our structure." A few of the younger employees exchanged glances. There was some anxiety, but in their eyes a flicker of hope. Perhaps for the first time they felt this company was more than a timesheet and a paycheck, but a living entity they could influence and that would care in return. Elijah paused, then continued, this time with a gentler tone and clear intent for change. "We're going to establish an anonymous feedback system. If something's wrong, if someone acts disrespectfully, if anyone makes you feel like your worth has been diminished, you'll be able to speak up, and I guarantee someone will listen." The room began to stir, heads started to nod, and Olivia quietly smiled, not out of pride, but from witnessing the genuine beginning of something restorative. Elijah stepped forward once more, this time speaking like a confidant rather than a commander. "I didn't build Monarch to become the richest man in retail. I built it because I wanted a place where anyone who walked in could feel like they mattered, no matter what they wore, what they carried in their wallet, or where they came from. But today, I see that slipping away, and I can't let it." He turned to Olivia, walking closer in front of the group, as if offering a quiet tribute. Thank you for reminding me of that, not through words, but through action. Olivia hesitated slightly, then replied softly, I just try to live the way I hope others would treat me. Elijah nodded. And it's because of people like you that I know this company still has hope. He turned back, looking one last time at everyone in the room. If you're ready to start over, so am I. But from now on, we won't live by reports. We'll live by how we treat people. As Elijah left the room, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. For the first time in months, he no longer felt cold inside. Not because everything had been fixed, but because he knew he had just laid the first brick of a foundation he once thought was lost. And this time, it would be built with truth. In the world of business, culture is not measured by payrolls or sales figures, but by how an ordinary customer is treated when no one thinks they matter. Elijah did not choose anger, he chose dialogue. And sometimes, to change an entire system, all it takes is one person brave enough to take a step back, to truly listen. If you believe that every customer deserves respect, please like this video, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss stories of change that come from within, and leave a comment with the phrase, protect values. Because how we treat others is the true measure of any brand.